about 1490 BC, the children of Israel were delivered out of Egyptian bondage by the power of God through his servant Moses. Moses was to deliver them to the land of promise, that they might receive that promised land, and to the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And because of their unbelief and their lack of faith and their rebellion, God allowed Moses, or caused Moses, to lead them in the wilderness for 40 years. And when it came time for them to cross into the land of Canaan to conquer it, Joshua was chosen by God to be Moses' replacement, because you remember that Moses disobeyed God in his own life and was not allowed to pass over himself. The conquest of the land of Canaan took about 6 years. And we read about that, of course, in the book of Judges. And after the 6 years and the conquest that was for the land, after Joshua's death, around 1443 BC, the children of Israel had no sovereign leader after Joshua's death. But they were led by a series of 15 judges over a period of about 400 years. Now, to put that in perspective, 400 years in perspective, I know we throw these years around and we talk about 1,000 years BC, and we talk about, to put it in perspective, the United States of America is only about 234 years old. So when we're talking about 400 years, we're talking about almost twice the time since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So the nation of Israel was led by judges over this period of time. And of course, after this period of time, Samuel being the last judge, because the children of Israel began to demand a king, like the nations round about them, remember. And this was about 1095 BC. And this closed the period of what we call the period of the judges, and began the period of the kingdom of Israel. And the kingdom period has two parts. The first being that of the United Kingdom, extending through the reign of Saul and David and Solomon, and each reigning for a period of 40 years. And then the second period is that of what's referred to as the divided kingdom, and the kingdom divided, Judah and Israel, and they were independent states, one separate from the other one, and both were carried off eventually into captivity. And the kingdom of Israel, which is referred to commonly as the northern kingdom, was ruled by a total of 19 kings. And finally, under King Hoshea, was captured and taken into Assyrian captivity and slavery, and never to return as a nation again. That was in 721 BC. And the northern kingdom, from the first king, Jeroboam, was an idolatrous nation, and refused to serve God, and that had brought them out of the Egyptian bondage. Remember Jeroboam and his rebellion against Solomon and rebellion against the people, fearing that the Jews would return to Jerusalem and worship, built two temples for them to worship in. they turned to idolatry and were led off and never returned from idolatry. And the northern kingdom worshipped idols throughout their existence, approximately 254 years. And again, that span of time is about the length of time that our nation's been in existence. So, but then the kingdom of Judah, which is commonly referred to as the southern kingdom, was ruled by a series of good and bad kings. Some of the kings in the southern kingdom followed God's will, obeyed God, was faithful servants of God. Others mostly were bad. There were some that was bad and some good, and they switched. They were not consistent. Mostly were bad. They were taken away into Babylonian captivity in 606 BC. And the kingdom of Judah consisted only of two tribes. We're familiar with the fact that it was Judah and Benjamin, and was ruled by a series of 20 kings. And the last being Zedekiah. And the kingdom of Judah also rebelled against God, and God totally, or finally allowed her to be taken into captivity to purge her of her idolatry. And remember, she was in captivity for about 70 years. Babylon was in the midst of overtaking Assyria. And the great city of Nineveh fell to Babylon in 612 BC. And Nebuchadnezzar, remember, the great general of Babylon, his army was besieging Jerusalem when his father fell gravely ill, and he was called back to Babylon to take over the throne and become king. Well, on his return, when he left Judea, and on his return, he carried with him some young Jewish boys. We don't know the real age. It could have been from 16 or 18 to 20. It depends on who you want to listen to, telling how old they might have been. But we're familiar with four of those boys, and we learn about them thoroughly in the book of Daniel. And we find out about Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they were made eunuchs. And they were placed in a situation where they were taught the language of the Chaldees and were being trained to be servants to the king of Babylon. Daniel chapter 1, verse 4. But because of sin, God punished the kingdom of Judah, and as a consequence, those that deserved to be punished were punished. But kind of ironically, Daniel and these three friends of his were faithful servants of God, but they had to suffer the consequences of those in the kingdom that were evil. And so they were taken away by King Nebuchadnezzar, and they were being trained to be people of his in his palace and his servants. Well, this situation that they found themselves in provides us, in the book of Daniel, provides us with some great lessons, and provides us some lessons that helps us today, even today, as we try to live our faithful life to God. And so that's what I want to look at. I know I've taken a long time for the introduction, but I wanted us to have a mind and kind of have a focus on what situation these four boys were in, these four young men were in. And the fact that the situation they were in, they came out of a land that was mostly idolatry, even though it was the land Canaan. It was the kingdom of Judah, God's chosen people. It was a nation of idolatry. But they had been rebellious against God. That's the reason God allowed them to be taken away, to be captured. And yet these 4 young men were faithful servants of God. And they showed just how faithful they were under the greatest trials that anyone could ever imagine. And we will first want to look at their example and learn that the power to abstain from worldliness, first of all, comes from a heart that has purpose, or a purposed heart. Notice what Daniel says in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, or what it says about Daniel. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portions of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." That took courage for him to make that request, I'm sure. Nebuchadnezzar was a religious man. He was an idolater, but he was very religious. In fact, his meals and the meat, especially in his meals, most of the time, or a lot of time, was the result of idol sacrifice, sacrifice to idols. The meat was first sacrificed to the idols, and it was brought to the king for the king to eat, and for him to serve in his I guess we'll call it a cafeteria. I'm not sure how that works, but he was the things he ate and those that ate with him. And he served and worshipped the idol. He was religious, and to him this portion of meat was part of the idol worship. Well, Daniel understood that. And he didn't want to participate in that. Daniel didn't want to be associated with, he didn't want to associate himself with the king and his idol worship. So he purposed in his heart not to partake. Purpose carries with it the force of being willed and determined not to do it. He was determined that he wasn't going to do it. He willed himself not to do it. And to the best of his ability, he wasn't going to do it. And so he had a plan. He put up his plan, of course, before the one in charge that he was under. And David and his 3 friends would eat pulse or vegetables for 10 days, and then the keeper could see who fared better. They that were those who ate the king's food or the king's meat and drank the king's wine, and the keeper agreed for them to do that. And of course, Daniel and his friends proved favorably and fairer than the others, as the scriptures tell us. Today, when we look at this situation today, we must also have a purposed heart. If we wish to overcome temptation, if we wish to be faithful to God, we must have a willing and determined attitude, like Daniel and his friends did. We cannot accidentally be faithful. It's just not going to happen. We're human beings. And if we just kind of willy-nilly kind of live our lives, we're going to get caught up in something. We're going to be led away by someone. We're going to have temptations that we're not going to be able to deal with because we haven't dealt with it before in our minds. Most of us plan our Christian life. When we obeyed the gospel, we plan to be faithful. We plan to worship faithfully. We plan to study our Bible faithfully. We plan to do what God has asked us to do in His faithful way as we can. We purposed in our heart. We made that commitment to God. Sometimes we're not successful. Sometimes we fall away. Sometimes we slip up. Sometimes we let something slip up behind us. Sometimes we slip on a banana peeling. Sometimes we just mess up. But we can't be faithful unless we purpose in our heart to be faithful. How do we have a purposed heart? Well, first of all, we're told in Scripture that we must love God. Love God with all of our hearts. If we love God with all of our hearts, then Jesus said unto them, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. Matthew 22:37. And that's the first step in having a purposed heart, is loving God. Next, we must not only have a love for God and have a desire and a willingness and determinedness to be faithful and purpose in our hearts to follow Him, but we must, in order for that to happen, we also, besides loving God, we must hide His Word in our hearts. Scripture tells us that this will help us. Thy Word have I hid in mine heart, that I might not sin against Thee. That's what David said. Psalm 119, verse 11. And then Jesus said another help is that we have to deny ourselves. And we have to deny ourselves, and we have to devote our lives to Him. That's what He asks us to do. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow after me. Luke 9, verse 23. These are things that will help us. And we can look back at the example of Daniel and his friends and see how that worked for them. And then we can understand that it will work for us too. If we will purpose in our hearts to serve God, to be faithful to God in every case, in any instance, then when temptation comes our way, the decision has already been made that we're not going to sin. Have you ever thought about it that way? I bet there's not a person in here that would say that I'm going to sin. I know we fall short. I don't mean we're sinning. But you're not planning to sin, is what I'm saying. You're not determined that you're going to sin. In fact, you're determined not to, right? We're determined to be faithful. And so these principles will help us be faithful. These principles will help when we're tempted to follow after the crowd. You know, it would have been easy for Daniel and his three friends just to, fall into the gang and just follow the crowd and not say anything and just eat and keep their mouth shut. After all, those people out, our families and all those people that are still in Judah, they're not going to know about it. They're never going to find out about that we were eating this meat and drinking this wine. But God knew, and they knew God knew, and it meant something to them to be faithful to God. So having a purposed heart, when the temptation comes to follow the crowd, we have the strength to say no. We have the strength to say, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do that. And when we are discouraged because of others' unfaithfulness or because of the way other people are treating us, Again, do you think it was easy for Daniel and his friends? Do you think they were not mocked or not kidded or not teased or not scoffed at or not rebuked by any of those others that may have been there? I dare say that there was a lot of discouraging words pointed towards their way. Who do y'all think y'all are? And then when we're downtrodden because we think that no one cares, I dare to say that Daniel and his friends could see many symptoms of anybody caring about what they thought, what they wanted to do. I believe they were standing alone in the midst of a kingdom of idolaters. And yet their faith stood strong. And they were determined, they were purposed in heart to be faithful. And if we will have that purpose in our own lives and our purpose in our heart to be faithful to God, when things get tough, the decision to be faithful has already been made. A second lesson that we can learn from Daniel and his friends is the power of associations and influence can help or can hinder. Daniel and his friends were in a tough situation. And as they were there and trying to be faithful and in purpose to be faithful and doing their best to be faithful, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. We all remember that dream. He couldn't remember it. He couldn't remember the dream, nor he couldn't remember, didn't know what it meant. He remembered he had a dream, but he couldn't remember what it was. And this was troubling him. So he sought answers from his wise men. Eventually Daniel was given the opportunity and brought before him, and Daniel was able to tell him the dream, not only tell him the dream, but tell him the interpretation of it. And Daniel chapter 2 is where we read about this. And the dream centered around a great figure. If you remember, it had a head of gold. It had breast and arms of silver. It had a belly and thighs of brass. And it had legs of iron and feet of iron, part iron and part clay. And the interpretation of this dream included the empires which would be ruling the world from this point in time until a certain time in the future. And we understand that dream today to be referring to the then world empire of the Babylonians. And then they were eventually overthrown by the Medes and Persians. And then Alexander the Great conquered the Medes and the Persians, and Greece became the third great empire, and then later Greece fell to the Romans. And these four empires, we understand that this is what this great vision or great dream was that Nebuchadnezzar had. The prophecy was made concerning a time during which the Roman kings, and Daniel chapter 2 says in verse 44, says, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. This was a reference, of course, to the kingdom of Christ and how it would be different from the kingdoms, all the kingdoms that had come before it, and all the kingdoms that would come after it, as far as that goes. And after the revelation of this dream, Daniel was promoted. Chapter 2, verse 48. It says, Then the king made Daniel a great man, and gave him many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel also requested his friends to be promoted. Verse 49. Then Daniel requested the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's the three names that the young men were given by the Babylonians over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Daniel sat in the gate of the king. Daniel not only was looking out for himself, but he was looking out for his friends. And he requested, his request for them, they were sent out into the provinces and had great influence over others. But Daniel stayed in the king's palace, and he sat in the gate of the king, or at the gate for the king. But Satan didn't let that alone. It looked like they won. They were faithful to God. That's not the point. Is that it looked like maybe they'd be okay. But Satan, he didn't let it alone. He first attacked those out in the province. And an image, he caused the image to be set up, or there was 90